Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 25th lecture in our course on general psychology. In this lecture, we'll wrap up our unit on social psychology, and we'll focus, as I call it, on psychology in a complex society. So last time we talked about aggressive behavior, cooperative behavior, sexual selectivity, and a lot of that material deals with small groups or even just two people. And here we're going to deal with larger groups, and we're going to deal with strangers and how we understand people that we don't know that well, and still understand how strangers and large groups can have a big impact on our behavior as we observe their actions. So we'll be learning about interacting with complex groups and society at large. And society at large and other people can be important cues for what to do. And I mean that both in terms of normative behavior, that is, what are sort of unspoken but arbitrary rules for society, and also ethical behavior, actually learning about what's the right thing to do. So part of that process is understanding what's true about the world. We've already gone through our unit on development, where small children learn sort of about the rules of the physical world. Uh, but here we're going to look at the rules of the social world and how we use information that comes from other people to tell us about how we should behave, how the world works, and about what's true. We'll also, at the end of this lecture, look at how we understand others, how we make judgments about other people, and some of those are negative and some of those aren't. We make judgments all the time. This is not to say that judgments need to be negative. We just make inferences about other people from their behavior. So we'll look at that process as well. So what we're going to do is see that literal incentives have a big impact on us. They shape our behavior. Obviously, we live in a complex society with laws and social norms, and there are incentives for following them, and there are penalties for breaking them sometimes. And so those incentives can be powerful when it comes to generating behavior. We'll also see that other people can be a source of bias for our picture of the world, for our idea of what's accurate about when it comes to describing the world, and also ethical norms. What's the right thing to do? And especially when it comes to conformity and authority, this is an important thing to think about, that other people have a big impact on what at a given moment we consider to be right or ethical. We'll also look at stereotypes and how stereotypes can be used to infer qualities of other people, and those inferences may be accurate, they may not be. And so we'll look at some of the sources of stereotypes and how we describe stereotypes. And we'll also see that when it comes to trying to understand other people, that we often give ourselves more credit than we give other people. So we might think of other people as being simpler than we are, when in reality, probably everyone else is as complex an individual as you are. So we're a little bit biased when it comes to judging ourselves versus judging others. So we'll look at that at the end. So first we'll start off with social influence, which is just a way of saying uh, the ability or the phenomenon by which uh, our behavior can change or direct another person's behavior. And this could be very direct. It could be literally telling someone what to do, or it could be just behaving the best way we think we should. And if someone else observes that behavior, that can exert a more subtle but still a powerful influence on their later behavior. And we're going to break this kind of influence into three major categories. So one of them is what we call a hedonic motive. We've run across that word before, hedonic, meaning having to do with pleasure. It goes back to the same root word as hedonism or hedonist. And so the hedonic motive is really about direct incentives. When someone warns you that there will be a penalty if you behave a certain way, or tells you that you'll be rewarded for behaving a certain way, those are hedonic motives. We'll also look at the approval motive. So we all want to be liked. We all want to be thought well of and approved of. And so sometimes our desire for the approval of others can bias our behavior. Sometimes that's a negative phenomenon. Sometimes we conform for the sake of others' approval, when in fact we were going to make the right decision before that bias could be felt. And also, we want to be right. We want to be right ethically, but we also want to be right in a pure informational sense. So we want to have the right picture of the world. We want to be uh, the sort of person that accurately perceives the world around us and knows what's going on. And so that can also be a powerful motive. And because we want to understand the world, we can again be influenced by other people's behavior, other people's opinions. And so sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's not so okay. So there are both positives and negatives for all of these things. I'm going to mainly talk about the negatives in the context of some of these experiments, because a lot of these experiments were interested in how these dark sides of human behavior show up. Everyone is well intentioned. Everyone wants to think of themselves as a good person. And yet, there's a lot of bad behavior in the world. So, a lot of experiments have looked at how this comes about. Why do these things happen? We talked about some instances last time with things like social loafing and the bystander effect. And we'll get into similar phenomena in this lecture. So there are positives too, and I'm going to mention those here. So learning from other people can be very efficient. So if other people know what's going on or know the right thing to do, why not listen to them? Save ourselves the effort of going through that learning experience. So it can be very efficient. And if everyone else is right, if you think the majority of people are right most of the time, then why not just listen to the majority opinion and go with that? And so a lot of the times we do this without thinking, and nothing much happens as a result. It turns out okay, especially when it comes to things like social conventions. But sometimes there are downsides, and so we'll talk about those in this lecture today. So first, briefly, we'll talk about the hedonic motive. This one's pretty easy to understand. So the hedonic motive deals with rewards and punishments. So when you are offered a reward or a punishment based on your behavior, that can obviously influence your behavior. And those rewards and punishments are in this unit because they come from other people. Notably, parents when you're very young. So parents use rewards and punishments to shape the behavior of their children. And obviously, we know that parents can be very powerful influence. They can shape our behavior, especially when we're in those early developmental stages where we don't have abstract reasoning. We can't think about right and wrong in a hypothetical sense. Um, but we can understand rewards and punishments. And so we can base our behavior based on what's going to give us a reward or avoid a punishment. Government policies also use the hedonic motive when it comes to influencing behavior. So laws come with penalties if you break them. And there are, of course, government incentives as well. So you might get a tax break for buying a certain car or for behaving in a certain way. You might have a financial incentive. And so there are government policies that either reward or punish in order to shape our behavior. So this figure in your bottom right portion of your screen is from your book. And this is looking at the law and its effect on driving behavior. So when penalties for things like drunk driving uh, are stiffened, when they become more severe, it does often have an impact on our behavior. Now, of course, our country has laws, but other countries have laws as well. In the mid-90s, there was a famous case in which an American citizen named Michael Fay was in Singapore and allegedly vandalized some property. And in Singapore, the laws are very strict. They involve stiff fines. They involve corporal punishment, caning in this case. And so Singapore, uh, as your book mentions also, fines people heavily for distributing gum or chewing gum. Um, And so that has a powerful impact on behavior. Singapore is very clean, has low crime rates. Of course, it is an open question whether the penalties that are threatened or are assessed on people, uh, whether those are ethically justified for the crimes they correspond to. And so, just because you can bias people's behavior with rewards or punishments uh, doesn't mean that it's necessarily okay. That their behavior is being biased does not imply consent or ethical uh, uh, ethical carte blanche. Uh, so government policies can seriously affect people's behavior when it comes to penalties and rewards. But again, it's a separate issue whether those penalties and rewards are just or ill-advised. And again, these can be very effective. As we see in the graph in the bottom right, uh, accidents did go down as a result of stiffer penalties in Massachusetts in this case. Again, Singapore, low crime rates, certainly not much gum chewing going on. So these can be very powerful, but they can also backfire. So if we remember back to our unit on motivation, we have a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. We had that experiment with the daycare center, where at first individuals were pretty good about picking up their children on time from daycare because they had an intrinsic motivation to do so. They wanted to be good people. They didn't want to take advantage of the employees of the daycare center. But then the daycare center started imposing fines for showing up late. So that is a kind of punishment. And yet, the behavior got worse because the fines weren't very severe, and also because that level of punishment was not as big an influence as the motivation people had before just to be good people. And so, when you're offering rewards and punishments, you have to be careful to think about what the consequences would be. Again, if you impose a really big reward or really severe punishment, that may be disproportionate to the need for the behavior you're trying to influence. Uh, if you offer too small a punishment or too small a reward, it may not have the impact you want. So we have to be very careful with hedonic motives. Another big one is the approval motive. And here we need to think about the power of norms. And what a norm is it's some sort of shared standard for how we're supposed to behave. Now, we just talked about laws. Laws are codified, they're often ratified by some sort of legislative body, they are official, they are part of public record. Uh, Norms tend to be a little bit softer. They are standards, but they're often unspoken. So there are all sorts of behaviors and guidelines that we abide by without even really thinking about it. We're probably not even aware when we learn them. But there are all sorts of behaviors that we exhibit or don't exhibit based on those norms. So there are a couple of important norms to think about. There are lots and lots of cultural norms, of course. What's acceptable in one culture that may not be acceptable in another, especially when it comes to things like hygiene, standards of dress, uh, behavior between strangers, between people of opposite sexes. Uh, so there are lots of different norms. We're certainly not going to go into all of them. But one broader norm is the norm of reciprocity. And so this can present itself in a couple different ways. Broadly, the norm of reciprocity is the idea that if I do you a favor, that you are in some sense obligated to do me one later. It's kind of a retroactive golden rule. The golden rule, of course, is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The norm of reciprocity is kind of the past tense version of that. So it's do unto others as they've already done unto you. And one way this can be used is what's called the door in the face technique. And this is a method by which an individual asks for a really big favor and gets denied, but then asks for a smaller favor, and then that one becomes accepted because the other person, by way of reciprocity, uh, feels obligated, since they denied the first favor, that they need to reciprocate and grant the second favor. And so your book uses the example of uh, experimenters going around and asking students if they would volunteer 2 hours a week of their time for the next 2 years. And that's a big request. Uh, and most of the time they got a no answer. But then they followed up and said, okay, well, how about you just chaperone this field trip? And they got a much bigger yes rate for that question after they'd already gotten rejected for the big favor. So this door in the face technique is a way of manipulating people, if you know about it, of asking for something you know you're not going to get, but don't really want up front. And then you ask for something smaller after that, and you're much more likely to get it. So norms are something, again, that are often unspoken. They're not written down somewhere. We're often, again, not even aware of them. But they can have a big influence on us. And so normative influence is the means by which other people's behavior tells us what we should do ourselves. So this, in the upper right of the slide, is an example from your book of an electric company that, or a portion of its clientele, sent out bills that showed what other people around them were using in terms of energy and how much the customer exceeded that. And so, again, this is not a law. You're not penalized for not doing what everyone else is doing. And yet, when people see that other people are using less energy, they tend to use less energy themselves. And so, again, there is not an explicit penalty or reward. This is not the hedonic motive. This is just trying to adhere to the same norms that everyone else is. And this shows up in more comical circumstances. So this is an image from Candid Camera, but it's an illustration of a common effect with groups of people. So what happened in this clip is that a person, a random person, walks into an elevator, and then other people start walking in as well. And as they walk in, normally, of course, people face toward the elevator door. They generally don't speak. They look straight ahead. This group of people, which were Confederates of this case, a TV show, all walked into the elevator and faced backwards. They all faced the back wall of the elevator. And 3 people did this. So now you've got a group. And now the sort of genuine participant, the real person, is now looking and seeing that all these people around him are facing the opposite way. And that exerts a powerful influence. And so eventually, several people were involved in this video clip, and they all eventually faced that back wall. There's no reason to do so. There's no door back there. And in fact, it goes against the usual norm of facing the elevator door. But the person can observe what everyone else is doing around them, and then does what they do. And this is related to the idea of conformity. So that is, again, part of the approval motive. We want other people's approval. We want other people to like us. And so we tend to do what other people do just because they're doing it. Again, no explicit reward or punishment is necessary. That people will often start imitating the behavior of those around them in order to conform, in order not to introduce conflict or potential confrontation into a social group. And this was illustrated probably most famously by an individual named Solomon Asch. And so Solomon Asch did an experiment in the 50s where groups of people came into a room and were told that they were going to judge 3 lines on a piece of paper and then look at 1 line on another piece of paper and say which of the 3 that line matched in terms of length. I know what was really going on is that everyone in the group, except for 1 person, was a Confederate. That is, they were an actor hired by the experimenter to behave a certain way. And at first they gave correct answers. This is not a hard task, by the way. There's no difficulty in discerning which line is the correct one to choose. But after a little while, all of the Confederates began to gave unanimous wrong answers. Now, visually, it's obvious that they're wrong. And then what Ash did is look at the proportion of people that conform to the wrong answer. They know what the right answer is. They could say it. And yet, they give the wrong answer, the same wrong answer that everyone before them did. And so this is surprisingly common. Not everyone conforms, but it is a powerful motivation. And even if people start off saying the right answer, after a couple of trials of this, they'll start to conform to the rest of the group. Now, of course, this is sort of comical in this particular situation. No one really cares if you're judging the length of the lines correctly. It's not so comical when you have things like mob behavior, or when you have people adhering to unethical rules and everyone just goes along because that's what everyone else is doing. And so conformity can be a real problem. It can be socially harmonizing, but it can also lead groups of people to do the wrong thing just because everyone else seems to be doing it around them. So that's the approval motive thing in the context of conformity and other normative influences. The approval motive is also at play when it comes to how we interact with authority figures. And your book refers to this as obedience. And so people have a tendency to do what authority figures tell them. It's part of what makes them authority figures. The idea is they have some knowledge or have some power that we are beholden to. But this also has a negative side to it. And of course, this research really ramped up in the context of World War II. People were very interested in what made individuals in Germany obey the Nazi Party, what made them join the Nazi Party. And so here, researchers were looking at why people conform, but also why people obey authority, even when those authority figures clearly are unethical. So one of the most famous experiments that looked at this is the Milgram experiment. So Stanley Milgram had people come in for an experiment, and he assigned pairs of people to either be a teacher or a learner. The fictitious purpose of the experiment was to look at the effect of electric shocks, negative feedback, on individuals' memories and learning. So what he had people do was, again, split into pairs. Now, what participants didn't know is that only one participant was real, and that was the teacher. The learner was, in fact, an actor. The electric shocks were not real. And so what happened was that the teacher would be sitting there, and when the learner gave an incorrect response, the teacher would have to shock them. And with every mistake, the voltage would go up. And after a little while, it was clear from the learner's response that these were very painful. In fact, as they continued, the learner would say that they couldn't take it anymore, or that they had a health condition by which they shouldn't take the sort of electric shock. And eventually the learner stops responding. Again, it's an actor, it's not real. But the teacher doesn't know that. And so many teachers would question whether they should continue. And all it took to make them continue was the presence of an authority figure in a white lab coat saying, it's your job to continue. And so the teachers would continue to, quote unquote, shock the learner to the point, again, where a lethal shock level was being administered. And this is a very famous experiment about the power of authority and how obeying authority can make us do really unethical things. And these were normal individuals. These were just average, everyday American citizens. So that's the Milgram experiment. Another famous experiment that your book doesn't go into is the Stanford prison experiment. And this is another famous one performed by a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. And what Zimbardo did was, again, look at authority. A little bit different than how Milgram did. What Zimbardo did, is split groups of students into two distinct subgroups. One was guards, and one was a group of prisoners. Now, the guards had done nothing to earn that position, and the prisoners had done nothing wrong to be punished for. And Zimbardo set up a quote unquote prison in the basement of the building, and then over the course of a few days, uh, observed how those two groups interacted with one another. And very quickly, the guards became abusive, started humiliating the prisoners. A couple of the prisoners were so distraught they had emotional breakdowns and had to be released from the experiment. And Zimbardo himself, in fact, stopped the experiment uh, after only a few days. He had anticipated it to go for at least a week, and he had to stop it early because of the effects on the prisoners. And so this demonstrated that not only would the prisoner group enter a mindset where they treated the guards as though they were legitimate authority, which they weren't, but also the guards uh, took on this mantle of authority when it was completely arbitrary. They could have just as easily been assigned to the role of prisoner, and yet they started behaving in an aggressive and hostile manner simply because they've been given authority. So two very famous, very important experiments that demonstrate how susceptible regular, everyday people are to obeying authority and to exerting authority. Okay, so that's it for the approval motive. The third motive is the accuracy motive. And stems from our desire to be right, to have an accurate view of the world, to have a responsible code of ethics. And when it comes to the accuracy motive, uh, there's a factor that we call informational influence. And that is simply the idea that other people's behavior and actions tell us what's true. So if other people behave as though something is true, we have a stronger tendency to believe that it's true as well. Your book gives a good example of if you stand next to a tall building and look up and just stare, that many people will start to stare with you. They, again, infer that you're looking up for a good reason, so they start to look up also. And this is particularly important when it comes to things like persuasion. That is, our ability to change the beliefs and attitudes of other people. I know when it comes to persuasion, there are two flavors. One is systematic. And this is persuasion that's based on reason, it's based on evidence. And this is not as common a practice as we would like to think. We like to think that we are persuaded by evidence, by convincing arguments, when in fact, oftentimes we are persuaded by heuristic persuasion. So we've come across the term heuristic before. It's a guideline. It is a simple procedure that guides behavior. It is not always right. It is not always accurate. It can be very susceptible to mistakes, but it's quick and it's easy. And so heuristic persuasion is based on things like habits. It's certainly based on emotions. So when people try to persuade you, they will often devolve into an emotional appeal. And that is heuristic persuasion. You're being persuaded not based on the evidence or line of reasoning, but based simply on how someone's argument makes you feel. So in one famous study, what they did was they had participants listen to a speech. And this speech was about exam procedures at the university level. And one group of people was told that these would take effect very soon, and the other group of people was told that they would take effect perhaps 10 years in the future. So one group was very motivated to listen. This could impact their lives in very short order. The other group, it didn't matter to them as much. So the high motivation group that we see here on the right, they were persuaded by strong arguments. And it turns out that in this experiment that the arguments came from two individuals. One was indicated to be a Princeton professor, and one was indicated to be a high school student. So different levels of experience, different levels of authority, but within the experiment, uh, participants were exposed to strong arguments from both individuals and weak arguments from both individuals. So the experimenters could see the impact of each kind of argument from each kind of person. And again, when the participants were very motivated to listen and to consider the argument, they were swayed not by the position of the person, but by the strength of the argument. So they were being influenced by systematic persuasion. When they weren't as motivated, when they thought this would take effect in 10 years perhaps, they were more persuaded by the position of the individual. They thought that the Princeton professor had made the more persuading argument, regardless of whether they actually had or not. And so this is heuristic. It's based on habit in this case. We're used to listening to experts and taking their word for it. And so here, people took the expert's word for it and didn't really evaluate the argument. And they discounted the high school student's argument simply because the person was a high school student. So that is an example of the difference between systematic and heuristic persuasion. And people are capable of responding to either one. It depends, as we see here, on motivation. Advertisements use both kinds of persuasion. So if an advertisement lists all the qualities of a product, why that product is better than other products, that is usually systematic persuasion. When the product is placed alongside an attractive model or is associated with a popular song or is being promoted by a celebrity, that is heuristic persuasion. Those stimuli have nothing to do with the product, but they make us feel a certain way. And we associate that good feeling with the product. And so we find that advertisement persuasive based not on logic or reason, but based on heuristics. Also, when it comes to accuracy, we want our world view, so to speak, to be accurate. We want to have an accurate picture of the world. Part of that demands that we are consistent. So we can't believe one thing one minute and believe the exact opposite the next minute. You can't resolve those two. And so people have a need for consistency in their beliefs. And this can be taken advantage of with what's called the foot in the door technique. We've already seen the door in the face technique. This is the foot in the door technique. This is where you get someone to sign on to some principle or make some small gesture, and then you ask them to make a bigger gesture. And they are more likely to make that big gesture after the small one because they want to be internally consistent. Your book uses a good example. If you ask people to put slow down signs in their yards to protect the neighborhood, to keep people from speeding, they'll often say no. If you ask people just to sign a petition promoting safe driving, well, that doesn't cost anything. So they'll often say yes to that. And then if you ask them to put the sign in their yard, they're much more likely to say yes. Why? After all, they've already put forth some effort to sign the petition. It seems like they should be less likely to go along with it, given that they've already expended some effort. But they're being asked to exhibit behavior in the same domain. So they sign the petition. If they want to be consistent, if they really want to promote safe driving, they have to sign the petition, and then they have to put the sign in the yard. Otherwise, they're not being consistent. They can't claim to promote safe driving in one context, and then 1 minute later claim they don't care. So that's the foot in the door technique. You get someone to commit to a small behavior, and then in order to be consistent, they have to commit to a larger behavior. And this relates to a concept called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is the unpleasant sensation we have when we realize that our beliefs are inconsistent with one another, or that our behavior is inconsistent with what we know. And this was famously demonstrated by an experiment decades ago, in which participants participated in a really boring task. What we see here is one of the participants turning knobs on a board, and there are dozens of these knobs. and the entire task was for minutes on end to turn each knob half a turn or a quarter turn, and then go on to the next knob. And this took a long time. It was not very productive. Nothing happened as a result, and it was repetitive. And so people, not surprisingly, found this task pretty boring. That was not the contribution to psychology. We already knew that would happen. What was interesting was that participants were then asked to tell the next participant that the task was fun. Now, the task was not fun, but the experimenter told the participant that was about to go out that they would offer them either $1 or $20 to do this. And participants did it. They went out and they lied to the next participant and said the task was fun. Then they were asked how fun they themselves thought the task was. The people who received $20 were very honest with themselves. They said the task was not fun at all. The people that were only paid $1 are the surprising part. They reported the task being fun, or certainly more fun than the $20 group did. So why is that? Well, the logic is something like this. The people that were paid $20 went out and lied to a stranger about how fun the task was, but there's no real conflict there. They know exactly why they did it. $20 is a lot of money. So they know the task wasn't fun, and they know they lied to a stranger, but the fact they were offered $20, their behavior is consistent. They're just doing something for the sake of a lot of money. The people that were only paid $1 have a dilemma. They did not enjoy the task. They went out and lied to a stranger to saying it was fun, and then they were paid $1, which is not very much money. The way they resolved this dilemma, why would they lie for just $1, is they convinced themselves that the task was actually more fun than they really felt at the beginning. And so they would actually report, oh no, I didn't think the task was that bad. I thought it was pretty fun. So that is their way of resolving cognitive dissonance. They have to resolve the fact that they just lied to somebody. We're not paid very much for it. So the way they resolve it is by saying, oh, well, I didn't lie. The task actually was fun. And the $1 didn't really matter that much. So now they no longer experience that cognitive dissonance. They've resolved it by adjusting their perception of how fun the task was. So that's another illustration that as human beings, we have a need for consistency in our beliefs and in our behavior. Okay, now we're going to change topics a little bit, moving from how other people can influence us to how we try to understand other people, understand who they are, what their identity is, how they're likely to behave, what their attributes are. And one way in which we understand others is through stereotypes. And stereotypes, of course, has a negative connotation, and stereotypes can often be harmful. But what a stereotype is an inference about others based on the categories they belong to. So it's a kind of shortcut. And again, many stereotypes can have harmful results because you're not examining the person on their own merit. You don't know anything about them. You are making assumptions based on the group to which they belong. And one model, one perspective on stereotypes is what's called the stereotype content model. And this is the idea that groups of people are categorized along two dimensions. And those dimensions are warmth and competence. So warmth brings together the sort of feelings we have toward the group of people. Are we compassionate toward them? Do they make us feel happy? Are we drawn to them? Or do they fill us with a feeling of disgust? And so that is the warmth dimension. The other is the competence dimension. And competence is sort of what it sounds like, how good the group is at accomplishing tasks. Can they achieve their goals? Can they do things for themselves? And so any given group of people can be measured somewhere along this axis in terms of people's perceptions of them. So for the example, the elderly are often high in warmth and middle to low in competence. Um, Certainly there are competent elderly individuals, but as a group, the perception is that they have trouble taking care of themselves. They have trouble doing things for themselves. And so they score somewhat lower on competence, but people often feel warm toward the elderly. So they still feel compassion for the elderly. Uh, of course, racial groups follow around on these two axes in various locations. Um, Groups like the homeless tend to score low on both competence and warmth. They aren't very good at accomplishing their goals, according to the popular perspective, but they also don't inspire a lot of sympathy like the elderly do. Rich individuals tend to score high on competence, but low on warmth. So people don't feel very compassionate toward wealthy individuals, but they believe that the rich are capable of accomplishing their goals, capable of getting things done. So those are just a couple of groups, and again, there are lots and lots of different ways to categorize people. So the idea is that this is a system for categorizing individuals that people use unconsciously. We don't sit around thinking about which groups are warm and which groups are competent. Uh, but the idea is that this says something about groups that we compete with, for example. So we tend to feel low warmth for people that we compete with in one sense or another, for resources, for jobs, etc. But it says how we feel about members of a category on two measurable axes. Of course, talking about stereotypes in general, stereotypes are a form of labeling. And it turns out that just by having the label, that perceptions of differences between groups can be accentuated. So in this figure from your book in the lower right, uh, people were told about two groups, Group A and Group B. So arbitrary distinction. Group A is bigger than Group B. It has more members. And then people were told that members of Group A or Group B then committed either good acts, charitable acts, or criminal acts. So two kinds of actions. And then when asked later what they remembered, uh, participants overestimated the number of bad acts uh, exhibited by Group B. Now again, Groups A and B don't correspond to any socioeconomic group, to any national group, to any ethnic group. They're just Group A and B. And yet Group B committing the bad acts was particularly memorable. So people overestimated how often that happened. Why? Well, Group B individuals are rarer than Group A individuals. There are fewer of them. So when a Group B individual pops up, it's more memorable. The bad actions, bad behavior, was also not as common as the good behavior. So Group B members were rarer than Group A members, and bad acts were rarer than good acts. And so when a member of Group B committed a bad act of some sort, a criminal act, it was particularly memorable because you had two low probability events, a person from Group B and a bad action. And of course, the implications for people's memories with regard to members of the majority or minority um, committing such behaviors, the implication there is fairly obvious that if a member of a small group does something unusual, especially something bad, that it becomes more memorable, even if the act itself is the same as what members of the majority are doing. So another source of distorted memories uh, based on stereotypes and labels. And even in a more abstract sense, labels can have a powerful impact on perception. So participants were given either 6 lines on a piece of paper altogether, or were given two groups of lines, Group A and Group B. They're the same lines in both cases, but just by labeling them as Group A or Group B, people were rated the members within each group as being more similar to one another and more different from members of the other group. And so just by putting arbitrary labels on objects in a category, uh, it accentuates our perception of those differences. So stereotypes have a number of effects, and of course I don't need to detail many of them. We're all familiar with the negative impact that stereotypes can have. Uh, One less obvious effect of stereotypes is what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is where an individual that's a member of a particular group is aware of the stereotype for their group and tries to defy that stereotype, but because of stress and anxiety, ends up fulfilling that very stereotype. And this is most famously illustrated by what's called stereotype threat. And we've already talked about this in our unit on intelligence, so I'm not going to belabor it here. But if we recall, stereotype threat is, in the realm of intelligence testing, is the idea that certain groups, the stereotypes for these groups, are that they don't do as well on tests. And so the individual that's a member of this group is aware of the stereotype and is nervous about not doing well on the test and confirming the stereotype. And just by virtue of being nervous, they don't do as well on the test. And so that is a form of self-fulfilling prophecy, where the existence of the stereotype brings about the behavior associated with the group on the part of the individual. There's also perceptual confirmation, and this is more simply stated as people see what they expect to see. And so here, when people have a stereotype for a particular group, they are more likely to notice behaviors or events that confirm that stereotype. And they may even treat people in such a way that it brings about that very behavior. So that is what's called perceptual confirmation. You are confirming your existing perception of a group. And then finally, there's subtyping. Stereotypes can be fairly resistant to change. People hang on to them even when evidence comes in that they shouldn't. And so subtyping occurs when people are presented with an example of a member of a group that doesn't fit the stereotype, that's in fact very different from the stereotype. And if they're a little bit different, people might adjust their stereotype a little. If they're really different from the stereotype, then people just treat them as though they're the member of a category unto themselves. Saying, oh, well, that person's not really a member of that category, or they're a special case. So that way, they can acknowledge that the person doesn't fit the stereotype, and yet they're still allowing themselves to retain that stereotype. So how do we measure these things, and how do we try to counteract them? So one way of measuring them is through what's called the implicit association test. And this is a test that pairs images or pairs words and looks at people's reaction time. And so, and based on this diagram here from your book, it will pair an image of an African American individual with something negative, for example, in this case a bomb. Or it will pair a European American individual with something positive like peace. And people will respond more quickly if, again, if you have these unconscious stereotypes, they will respond more quickly if the symbols match their feelings about the categories. So the majority of white participants on the implicit association test are quicker to associate negative events like the bomb with African American faces. And they're quick to associate symbols like peace with European American faces. If you switch them to where the negative event is associated with the European American face and the positive event is associated with the African American face, they're slower to respond. They have a harder time making that association. And so that is supposed to be an indicator of, again, the implicit associations people make. They implicitly associate African Americans with a negative event. That's part of their stereotype. And so that association they make quickly. Associations that defy their stereotype are slower to respond. And there are ways of trying to counteract these phenomena. So stereotypes are unconscious to a large degree and automatic. People have not that much control over them, but they can train themselves to counteract these associations. So your book uses a famous example of a training task in which African American or European American individuals are holding either a gun or a phone, and people have to respond correctly based on whether it's a gun or a phone. Again, because of stereotypes, they associate the gun or the phone with certain racial groups. Uh, but once they're used to the task, once they're trained on it, they may not be able to override their implicit associations, but they can control their behavior once they're aware of this association. So that is one way of combating stereotypes, is through this sort of training process. Okay, when it comes to understanding others, people often use stereotypes to make assumptions about how other people are going to behave based on their group membership, but people also have to make attributions. And attributions are conclusions that we draw about other people based on their behavior. So there are two kinds of attributions. There are dispositional attributions, and these are inferences about a person uh, where we think their behavior is based on their identity or their personality. That is, that they're acting that way because they're this kind of person. That's in contrast to situational attributions, where we're effectively saying they're acting this way because of the circumstances. That if you change their situation, they'll act some other way. And so there, the attribution is not so much about who that person is, but about the situation they find themselves in. And so that is an important distinction, whether people act a certain way that we observe based on who they are or based on their circumstances. And this brings up what's called the covariation model of attributions. So we can make either a dispositional or a situational attribution when we observe someone's behavior. Your book uses the example of an individual wearing a hat shaped like a wedge of cheese. And so the question when you see that, or any other perhaps unusual behavior, maybe it's somebody dancing on the street corner, whatever the behavior is, this covariation model asks questions of consistency, consensus, and distinctiveness. So consistency is asking about whether this is part of the person's regular behavior, whether they do this often. Now, if they do this across a wide variety of situations, it's more likely to be part of who they are. It's more likely to be dispositional, the behavior. If it only happens once, well, it's more likely to be situational. Again, if it was a consistent part of the personality, then you would see it more often. Consensus is the second part of the covariation model. And this asks if other people are doing this too. So if other people are doing the same thing, it's less likely to be a quirk of the person's personality. It's more likely to be something that everyone's doing because of their situation. If multiple people are in the same situation, they're acting in a similar fashion, then the odds are that their behavior is a product of circumstance. It's unlikely that they're all exhibiting some unusual behavior because they're all the sort of person that does that. And then finally, distinctiveness. So is this part of a pattern of behavior on the part of the individual? So if the person wears a cheese hat, but also wears other weird clothing, then it's more likely to be dispositional, part of who they are. If they're wearing a cheese hat but are otherwise normal, or if they're dancing on the street corner but are otherwise normal, then that says more about their situation. So again, this covariation model looks at how often the person exhibits the behavior, whether other people are exhibiting it too, and whether the person also exhibits similar behaviors. Trying to get a handle on whether this behavior in particular is a product of circumstance or a product of the person's individual personality. And this leads us to what's called the fundamental attribution error. Now, your book uses terms like correspondence bias, actor-observer effect. These are generally detailed distinctions that we don't worry about. These all generally fall under a category that we call the fundamental attribution error. So I'll just use that one term to describe all of this. And what the fundamental attribution error is our tendency to make situational attributions for ourselves, but dispositional attributions for other people. That is, for a given behavior, we're more likely to say, well, I just acted that way because of the situation, if we're the one exhibiting the behavior. But if somebody else is doing it, you're more likely to say, well, that's sort of the person they are. They're behaving that way because of their identity or their personality. So, for example, if you and a friend are in the same class together, and you both do poorly on a test, you're more likely to tell yourself, well, I was busy this week, I didn't get a chance to study. But your friend who did just as poorly, you're more likely to say, oh, well, they're not a very good student. And so that's the difference between a situational attribution, where you can pawn off the behavior on the circumstances, and a dispositional attribution, where it's part of who that person is. And this is illustrated famously by the Quizmaster study, in which case individuals were asked to observe two other people. One person asked questions of the other person, and that second person had trouble answering them. Well, it turns out the person asking the questions also wrote the questions. So they wrote questions that they knew the answers to. Nevertheless, when the observer is asked to say who's more intelligent, the observer says that the person asking the questions is more intelligent. So they're ignoring the situation and making dispositional attributions about the person giving the questions and the person answering them. For the same reason why I've shown the picture here on the right of Alex Trebek. It's part of the reason why we think of Alex Trebek as being smart. He always has all the answers on Jeopardy. And yet it's because, well, his staff comes up with the questions. He's given the answers. And yet, when we were faced with the situation where Trebek seems to know all the answers and the contestants get a lot of them wrong or don't know, we make dispositional attributions about these people and say that Trebek is really intelligent and the contestants aren't as smart as Trebek is. So that is the Quizmaster study. Another famous study asked people to read essays that were either in favor or in opposition to the regime of Fidel Castro in Cuba. So the interesting thing is that these essays were either pro or anti-Castro. The participants read them and then were asked to rate whether the individual who wrote them was pro or anti-Castro. Well, what I've just told you, it's pretty obvious that if you write a pro-Castro essay, you must be pro-Castro. If you write an anti-Castro essay, you must be anti-Castro. Then participants were told that the position the essay writer took was based on a simple coin toss. So the person writing the essay had no control over what sort of essay they would write. And still, after reading those essays, the participants rated the writers of the pro-Castro essay as being more pro-Castro than the anti-Castro essay writers. Again, they knew full well that the sort of essay the person was supposed to write was governed by a coin toss. And yet they still made these dispositional attributions, that is, to say that their stance on Castro was part of who they were, that they believed it, versus situational attributions. The situation was that their topic, their position, was forced by a coin toss, and yet they still could not make that situational attribution for other individuals. So that's another example of the fundamental attribution error, by which we, again, make dispositional attributions for other people, but situational attributions for ourselves. And why do we do this? Well, it turns out trying to understand the situation that someone else is in can be really hard. We don't always know the situation that someone else is in. Situations are also really complex. There are a lot of factors going around. It's way easier just to say, well, that's the sort of person they are. They acted angry because they're an angry person, versus, well, they had all these irritating stimuli around them. They're really just responding to the situation. It's far easier just to make attributions about someone's personality than it is to try and understand what situation they're coming from. Okay, that will do it for our unit on social psychology. Next time we'll have a single lecture unit on stress. So first we'll look at what stress is, but also what causes stress, what makes something stressful. We'll look at physiology. So when we have a stressful experience, that's associated with a certain physiological state. We'll look at what happens when we are under stress, especially chronic stress. If you're under stress for a long time, it can affect psychological processes. It can also affect your health. And then we'll look at ways that people can manage stress. How do you minimize those negative consequences? So we will cover all of that next time, and I will see you then.